Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is it too late for an agreed political settlement to end the Syrian civil war? Recent advances of al-Qaeda-affiliated groups and the Islamic State suggest any regime following Assad will be radicalized, extremely brutal, and possibly aggressive. Would this be a case of the cure being worse than the disease? To Crosstalk the war in Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Richard Murphy in New York. He is a former U.S. career ambassador to Syria and currently an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute. Also in New York, we have Jason Herthler. He is a writer, political commentator, and contributor to Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, and other political communities. And in London, we cross to Sukhan Shandan. He is a political analyst and blogger. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want. Richard, if I can go to you first in New York, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. We had a U.S. Secretary of State Kerry. He was in Sochi visiting with Vladimir Putin this week. Among the things they discussed was Syria. Is there a possibility, finally, after all that has happened, that we could see some kind of political settlement, or are we going to see this regime eventually collapse? What are your thoughts?
Well, I've said for some time myself that it's only when the parties involved are so exhausted and worn out with the killing that you're going to see the possibility for diplomacy. Are we at that point yet? Well, we're closer. Are we there? I'm not sure.
Okay, Jason, weigh in there. What do you think?
Well, I think, Saudi Arabia is pretty annoyed with the administration, the Obama administration, because of its peace negotiations with Iran. And in the last week, we've had news of Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Jordan and Qatar recommitting themselves to regime change in Syria, in Damascus, and they are evidently creating, consolidating the rebel armies, basically the affiliates of al-Qaeda. And then we've heard that some of the moderate militias that Obama was arming are joining them. So they're creating this large, I think it's called a conquest army.
That's right.
That they're going to back and drive toward Damascus and try to overthrow Assad.
So, Khan, if I can go to you in London, in looking at what's going on in Syria and what we just heard from Jason, this image comes to my mind, and I'd like to know what you think about it. It looks to me there's a lot of arguing on the deck of the Titanic, and there's that iceberg out there, but everyone's still arguing about finding these moderate forces to force regime change. And you have al-Qaeda affiliated groups, we have Islamic State. They're there, and they're watching with great amusement as the fighting continues on the deck of the Titanic. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. But with the larger Arab sting that has been unfortunately visited upon the people of the region, particularly Libya and Syria, it's quite clear that that operation was going to unleash these sectarian death squad forces as the ground troops to the NATO bombing in the case of Libya and to the covert operation in the case of Syria. I think Syria is Afghanistan 2.0 for this generation in the sense that the Syria theater of operation for the Western powers is too important to wind down in any way. No, actually, they're going to ratchet up and continue their death squad operation against the Syrian government. It's too important in relation to their containment policy to the Iranian Islamic Republic, to Lebanese Hezbollah, and particularly to Syria's most important global ally, which is Russia. So very much so, the Western powers are using Syria just like they used Afghanistan in the 80s to weaken the global South powers, particularly Iran and especially Russia, and for Syria to be a crucible through which they can actually generate these death squad forces and unleash them across the Muslim world, and as we saw in the case of London and Paris, against Western capitals as well.
Okay, that's a very interesting thesis. Richard, would you like to weigh in on that? It's very interesting. Syria is Afghanistan 2.0. Go ahead.
Well, I don't agree with the proposition that Washington, the West, are plotting to weaken Iran and Russia so they can help spread the death forces across the Muslim world. Let me just quote briefly a comment that President Obama made to the Arab press Sharq al-Awsat earlier this week. He said that the policy of the United States is clear. Assad long ago lost all legitimacy, and since there's no military solution to Syria's challenges, there must ultimately be a political transition towards a Syria where universal rights, et cetera, are respected. I think that capsulizes the problem from the American standpoint. We have resisted getting pulled into Syria in any serious manner for the last 3 years, on the expectation, false as it turned out, that Assad was so weak he would be blown away by the winds of the Arab Spring. That didn't happen. And now the statement of President Obama says that there has to be not only a political transition, but he's used the word ultimately a political transition. So there is a role seen for President Assad, but also a conviction that he's not one for the ages as the leader of Syria.
Okay, well, Jason, if I can go to you, why should the United States determine who's the leader of Syria? Why? What right does it have to say somebody must go?
Well, it has no right. 88% of the Syrian people in the last election voted for Assad. So whatever crimes he's committed, the Syrian people want him there, and they are a sovereign state. And even though they're fragmenting badly, thanks to U.S. intervention, straight out of the CIA playbook, basically. But I think what is happening, what you're seeing in the press, which is really interesting, is 3 new reports, 2 from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that they found traces of sarin in artillery shells and in a scientific research center within Syria, and that they've also have evidence of barrel bombs with chlorine in it being dropped on rebel areas by the Syrian army. And then another report out of the Commission for International Justice, I think, and Peace, or this small organization created by the West, by the United States, by Britain, by the EU, all the usual suspects, no representatives from the Middle East on it, but they have evidently smuggled, received documents smuggled out of Syria that have documentary evidence to indict Assad for war crimes in the crackdown against the uprising in 2011 that incited this conflict. When you see that kind of, and it's really not coincidence that these charges are surfacing now, because we know that the chlorine bomb was, that story was told about a year ago, yeah. But right now the U.S. is pushing to find, assign responsibility and find evidence for that. And I think the idea is here to find an opportunity to go to the UN, get a resolution, and perhaps, like they did in Libya, have the United States create a no-fly zone in Syria, like they did in Libya.
Well, Jason, we all know how that ended. Okay, let me go back to London here, because I want to go back to the metaphor of the Titanic. Even U.S. military intelligence has been open that the more that Assad is degraded, the more advantages al-Qaeda-affiliated groups and the Islamic State have. But, okay, we know that. That's logical. But the U.S. isn't going to change its policy. It's not going to change its policy to regime change in Syria. I mean, that is just the ultimate fantasy land policy to even kind of think about what to move forward, because who's going to be responsible when there's a bloodbath against Alawites, Christians, and other minorities? Is anybody going to be held responsible?
Peter, there's already a bloodbath that is going on for a good part of 4 years in Syria, and also in the other parts of the Arab sting impacted, such as Libya. There's beheadings, there's mutilation, there's rape, there's looting. People's beheaded heads are put on the roundabout in the capital of Daesh in Syria, in Raqqa. So there's an ongoing massacre and bloodbath that's been happening, and that's out of design. It's not out of coincidence. And just to follow on the 2.0 Afghanistan analogy, it's also what what Britain, France, and the United States have done, particularly the United States and Britain, has developed their death squad strategy, which was laid out not only in Afghanistan in the wrongly named Mujahideen, but also in the Contra forces in Central and South America throughout the late 70s and 80s. All that's happened now is that the deceit has developed, the effectiveness through deceit has developed, in as much they're saying they're bombing their allies. So they are already actually bombing Syria, that's the United States, and they're bombing the infrastructure of Syria in the areas controlled by Daesh, and they're having no strategic impact. Actually, this bombing campaign, combined with a covert strategy, is developing the strength of the most notorious death squad, so-called ISIS, which anyway is in a hot-cold relationship with other open forces of the so-called non-existent FSA.
Okay, Richard, if I can go back to you, one of the things I've always found very odd about U.S. and Western policy towards Syria is that, well, let's say Assad goes today, before the end of this program. How will that change Syria?
I think that the American government has looked at the Assad regime as basically the most brutal regime conceivable. Over 220,000 dead since this conflict
many of whom in the Syrian
started
army.
rolling in 2011. Many of them in the Syrian army, many of them civilians, and then the disruption of life with the millions that have fled the country or been displaced within the country. He remains the president. The election, let's not dwell on the legitimacy, illegitimacy of that election, but it's kind of pathetic reasoning to say that the Syrian people have spoken in favor of that regime.
I apologize, I have to jump in. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the ongoing war in Syria. Okay, I'd like to go back to Jason in New York here. Again, Richard quoted the President of the United States, Barack Obama, about Assad. I just fail to understand how U.S. policy towards vis-a-vis Assad has anything to do with the Syrian people and their fate.
No, it's not about the Syrian people and their fate. I mean, we know the long-term strategy. It's still a neoconservative strategy, though Obama's in office. The original strategy was to topple 7 Middle Eastern countries in 5 years, and they've done several of those. And Syria is really the linchpin of support of the Shia crescent that keeps Iran from being isolated. If Syria goes, then Iran becomes isolated. It's just got Hezbollah as an ally. But that's a major goal of U.S. strategy, is to isolate Iran. And this Syria intervention that's building is all about the larger geostrategic picture. It's got nothing to do with the Syrian people, per se.
Okay, I'd like to go back to London. So can you explain to our viewers why Israel and Saudi Arabia publicly have stated that they would prefer to have Sunni radical Islamists on their borders than Assad? How does that make any sense at all after a decade of the war on terror? Go ahead.
Well, exactly, Peter. The war on terror is a fraud. It's none other than a neo-colonial war of terrorism against the people of the global south, particularly in the Muslim world. You see, what the death squads are actually delivering is exactly the strategic interests of London, Paris, and Washington, and also of Tel Aviv, because strategically, the Syrian Arab government is much bigger threat strategically to the Zionist state of so-called Israel than are these death squads. Actually, the United Nations itself has actually given formal complaints against Tel Aviv of why its army and health service is assisting the Nusra death squads on the occupied Jolan Heights region. So again, if we see the covert nature of the war effort from London and Paris, we can see that over 500 young people have left Britain to join Daesh in Syria, and this has been done under the watch of the British intelligence services, and it came out with Mazen Beg, a well-known former Guantanamo detainee, having meetings with the MI5, who ticked off his visits to Aleppo in Syria, illegal visits of course, to train death squads there. So really, when we understand the modus operandi and even the ethical conceptual nature of the death squads, they are supremacists. They think God has given them the right to massacre anyone so they can have their supremacy on this earth, which is no different to, we can say, to European white supremacy or the Zionist supremacy of the so-called Jewish state.
Okay, Richard, you know, if we look what's gone on in the Middle East, particularly in the last decade, let's say since the illegal invasion of Iraq, you know, these Sunni radicals have been empowered, they've been trained, they've been given money, and then they run amok, and you never can put them back in the proverbial bottle. Why do they think this time supporting these types of groups vis-a-vis against Assad is going to be a better outcome for the people of Syria and the region? I still don't understand that.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear you say you don't understand it. I don't think anyone understands the complexity that is Syria, that has been Syria and probably will remain Syria for all the time all of us are involved with it. They find it very, very difficult to cooperate politically between these various factions, be they radical, moderate, whatever labels you want to put on them. The fact is that at the end of the day, there's not going to be a military victory by Assad or by ISIS. There's going to have to be a negotiation. And thus far, the Assad regime has not shown any serious willingness to negotiate with the opposition. Their position is made easier by the fact that the opposition is so incredibly divided. But maybe with these efforts by Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the ones you mentioned, trying to pull them together, there will be some results. It's not yet shown to be a workable proposition that they can be a united opposition.
Let me go to London. Because I saw in London a disagreeing opinion there. So, what is your opinion here? Because I've never seen the U.S. sincerely want a peaceful outcome, at least an outcome that they can't control in Syria, and I don't see that now. What do you think?
Well, it's extraordinary what we've just heard. We just heard an open advocacy of negotiating at the table with the most infamous, notorious death squads that perhaps humanity has ever known, aside from the fact that, to quote Dr. King, the United States is still the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet. But in terms of non-state actors, can you have a more brutal, more depraved force than ISIS? But we have our colleague advocating the Syrian government should sit down and discuss peace talks with them. It's a nonsense. And it really points to the fact that,
I wasn't saying I didn't say that.
Go ahead, Richard.
I didn't say sit down with ISIS. I didn't say sit down with ISIS. I said
you did, sir. Get
the negotiations going that started at Geneva with the various opposition elements, not ISIS, between them and the regime. The regime has shown no flexibility as yet to negotiate with its various opponents and critics.
Okay, Jason, all right, go to London, because I think incorrect. I think it's the reverse, Richard. I think the Assad regime did go and sit down, and they had nobody to talk to. That's the historical record.
Exactly, exactly.
But they had nothing to say, nothing to offer in terms of a meaningful transition.
Assad didn't show up in Geneva. Assad didn't show up in Geneva. That meeting was held without him.
The facts in Syria. The facts in Syria.
Jason, go ahead. Then we go to London. Go ahead. Jason.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is there's no great solution here. There's no good solution. What we've got is a series of evils, and we've got a lesser evil probably in Assad and greater evils in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and it looks like the United States is going to back the greater evil.
Okay, London, let's jump in. That's pretty pathetic if it's true. Go ahead.
Well, the facts are the Syrian government has been actually operating and rolling out a series of reconciliation strategies and actually having local armistice agreements with the formerly weaponized and armed gangs. So it's not true to say that the Syrian government is not interested. They are interested. They're actually vested in reconciliation. There's a Ministry of Reconciliation in the Syrian government that's actually delivering this for the Syrian people. I'm haunted by what happened in Libya, and in many ways Syria is a slow motion.
Jason?
What happened in Libya, because... Go on.
Go ahead, Jason. Want to jump in? Go ahead.
No, honestly, it makes no difference that Assad is trying to reconcile. He's either going to have to step down, which he may agree to do at the last minute when he sees the handwriting on the wall, and if he doesn't step aside, he's going to get steamrolled by this conquest army and then air cover from the United States.
Okay,
they're going to change the regime. They're committed to doing that.
Richard, let me go to Richard here, because Richard has a lot of experience here. Listen up, gents. Richard, hypothetical right now, thinking about Afghanistan, thinking about Iraq, thinking about Libya. Let's say there's regime change. What's next? Has anybody thought about it? Because precedent would say that nobody's thought about this in the halls of power in Washington. Does that bother you?
I don't think personally anybody gave enough, that people gave enough thought in Washington to the Iraqi invasion and conceivably to what Afghanistan became as a conflict scene. They have been, and I think the president exemplifies this, learning that we cannot pick leaders in that part of the world. And he has been extremely cautious in authorizing any actions involving U.S. forces.
Libya?
I don't think these are not great success stories. Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan.
No one wants to talk about Libya anymore, Peter.
I think he's being very careful about Syria.
Sukan, I know on this program, when we did a program recently, almost no one from the past that was on this program before wanted to appear because they were afraid I would show the sound bites, okay? Go ahead. You wanted to, nobody wants to talk about Libya. Go ahead.
Well, absolutely. The lessons of Libya no one wants to learn, and it's a shame that both of our colleagues who are guests on this show are both in agreement that Assad must go, and it reflects that throughout the left to right political spectrum, at least in the West or a Eurocentric way, they're in agreement that that part of the problem is Assad. No, Assad is part of the solution. Assad is part of the Syrian people's choice in leading them through this horror story which has been visited upon them out of design, not out of coincidence. And again, you know, again, it's kind of similar to people don't want to discuss Libya, and they don't want to discuss what the roots of this conflict are. Haven't we seen this in Ukraine? Haven't we seen this in all the other color revolutions, and in Libya as well, and perhaps also in Egypt as well? That the Western intelligence, with their special forces, under the cover of so-called civilian opposition, usually around elections, weaponize a situation of small protest and bring in the death squads to take over this whole movement, which was designed for them to take over anyway. No, Assad is the legitimate president of a sovereign country of the global south, and respect is due to all the global forces who have protected Syria, because the protection of Syria is not just the protection of Syria, but protecting Syria and drawing a red line after Libya is the protection of the world's humanity, i.e. all those people live in global south countries, the majority of which are victim to covert and overt regime change strategies and tactics by the West.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jason. I'm going to give you a last word on the program. You know what I think the outcome is this going to be? It's just going to be war, unending war. Regime change, now they have a new, ISIS, now we got to go to war with them. And Al-Qaeda is back, you know, and you just start stir over and over again. Taxpayers, body bags, civilian deaths. Jason.
That's the war on terror.
Jason, 15 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. You know, there was a good article in Foreign Policy recently that drew parallels between the Bay of Pigs disaster and Obama's strategy to arm the rebels. And it's a failed strategy, but now that the Middle East, now Saudi Arabia and Turkey are going to go in and do the job that Obama wanted done, and he's going to provide air cover. It's going to be a disaster, but divide and ruin is the policy.
All right, on that very depressing note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in New York and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
I love you.